Everyone ignored the warm grave under his firewood. Elias Thorne, who had survived 15 Nebraska winters and buried a son, told him, "Dig holes instead of stacking wood, and your wife freezes first, the boy after." He had $12, a sick wife, a 9-year-old son, and could not cut the 8 cords of wood he needed. On January 12, 1888, the temperature dropped 60 degrees in 8 hours. But 4 months earlier, Martin Vale had never built a thing below ground. He had arrived in Gage County in the first week of September, 1887, with a wife whose cough had started somewhere in Iowa and a son who had not stopped asking when they would reach the new farm. Martin Vale had been a renter his whole adult life. $23 remained from selling the mule team, but 8 more came from the furniture Ada's mother had given them. The relinquishment papers for the quarter section cost him 19 of those dollars, leaving him 12 to start a life that demanded hundreds. The land agent in Beatrice had called it an opportunity. A previous claimant had abandoned the property after 2 seasons, leaving behind partial improvements, a house, outbuildings, a well that still drew water. Martin had signed the papers without seeing the place because the alternative was returning to Iowa with nothing. The wagon crested the last rise on a Thursday afternoon. Noah stood on the seatboard and pointed. Ada said nothing. The house was a frame structure, 16 by 20 feet, with gaps between the boards wide enough to see daylight through. The roof had been patched with what looked like flattened tin from old cans. One window held glass. The other held oiled paper that had torn at the corner and flapped in the wind. The door hung crooked on leather hinges. Beyond the house stood a barn with no south wall, a chicken coop with no chickens, a privy leaning 11 degrees from vertical, and a woodshed whose floor, Martin would later discover, was rotted through in 3 places. Noah asked if this was really it. Ada started coughing and did not stop for nearly a minute. Martin climbed down from the wagon and walked the property line. The grass stood waist high. No one had worked this ground in at least a year. The previous claimant had left behind a plow with a cracked blade, a scythe missing its handle, and a cast iron stove that sat in the middle of the main room like a monument to someone else's failure. He opened the stove door. A mouse nest filled the firebox. The flue pipe had rusted through in 2 places. This was the opportunity. Elias Thorne arrived on the 3rd day. He came on foot from the neighboring claim, a half-mile east, and he did not knock. He stood in the doorway and looked at the gaps in the chinking and the mouse nest Martin had not yet cleared from the stove and the pile of belongings still sitting in the wagon because there was nowhere clean to put them. Thorne was 62 years old. He had homesteaded in Nebraska in 1871, when the Pawnees still held treaty rights to hunting grounds not far from where they stood. He had buried a son after the winter of '81. He had buried a wife the year after that. He had survived 15 Nebraska winters, and his face showed every one of them. He did not introduce himself. He walked past Martin and into the house and began counting. 1 stove, rusted flue. He kicked the pipe with his boot, and a section crumbled. 1 room, 16 by 20, chinking, half rotted. He pressed his thumb into the wall near the window frame, and the wood gave like wet bread. 1 window with glass, 1 with paper. Roof patched, but not sealed. He looked up at the ceiling, and Martin could see 3 points of daylight through the gaps. Thorne walked outside. Martin followed. The woodshed. Thorne kicked the door open and stepped inside. The floor groaned. He stamped twice, and a board cracked. Then he counted what was stacked against the walls. Martin had already counted it himself. But hearing it from Thorne made the number worse. 1 3/4 cords, maybe 2 if you counted the green stuff that would not burn clean until spring. Thorne came out of the woodshed and looked at Martin the way a doctor looks at a patient he cannot help. "You have a wife in there." It was not a question. "I do." "And a boy. 9 years old." Thorne looked at the house, then at the woodshed, then at the sky. September in Nebraska could fool a man. The days were warm, the grass still held green. The killing cold felt like someone else's problem. You need 8 cords minimum to keep that house warm through February. 10 to be safe. You have 2. Thorne's voice carried no anger, no judgment, just arithmetic. The nearest timber worth cutting is 6 miles. You have no team. You have a wagon, but nothing to pull it. How much money do you have left? Martin did not want to answer, but Thorne waited, and the silence stretched. And finally Martin said, $12. Thorne nodded slowly. A cord of cut and split hardwood runs $4 to $5 delivered. A cord of green oak you cut yourself runs $2 for the rights plus your labor. You cannot afford to buy wood. You cannot haul wood without a team. You cannot cut enough wood alone in the time you have. I can work faster than you think. No. Thorne shook his head. You cannot. I have seen men try. I have seen men convince themselves they could do 6 months of labor in 6 weeks. I have helped bury 3 of them. Ada appeared in the doorway. Her cough had quieted, but her face was pale, and she leaned against the frame as if standing required effort. Thorne looked at her, just then back at Martin. If you spend November digging holes instead of stacking wood, your wife will freeze first and the boy after her. Martin felt the words land like stones. I am not digging holes. I'm trying to fix what is broken. Everything here is broken. Thorne gestured at the house, the shed, the barn with no wall. The man before you spent 2 years breaking it. You have 4 months to fix what he ruined. You cannot do it. Then what do you suggest? Thorne was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, sell the relinquishment. Take whatever you can get. Go back to Iowa before the first snow. Find a place with walls that hold and a stove that draws and neighbors who can loan you fuel when you run short. I cannot go back to Iowa, or there's nothing there. There is nothing here either. Thorne turned and started walking toward his own claim. Over his shoulder, he added, the first hard freeze comes in 6 weeks, maybe 7. When it does, you will understand what I'm telling you. Martin watched him go. Ada said nothing. Noah stood beside the wagon and asked if the neighbor was angry at them. Martin said no. The neighbor was just telling the truth. The next 3 weeks were a lesson in the weight of work. Martin rose before dawn and worked until he could not see his hands in front of his face. He cleared the mouse nest from the stove and replaced the rusted flue sections with pipe he bought from a hardware store in Beatrice for $2.60. He stuffed the gaps in the chinking with mud and straw and moss pulled from the creek bank a 1/4 mile south. He patched the roof with tar paper that cost another $1.50. He repaired the crooked door and replaced the oiled paper in the second window with a piece of glass salvaged from a broken frame in the barn. He split every piece of wood he could find on the property. The rotted boards from the chicken coop, the broken fence rails, the fallen limbs from the cottonwood at the corner of the claim. He added perhaps half a cord to the stack. Not enough. Nowhere close to enough. Ada worked beside him when her cough allowed. Noah gathered kindling and sorted nails from a bucket of rusted hardware left by the previous claimant. The 3 of them ate salt pork and cornmeal mush and counted the days until the weather turned. By the end of September, Martin had spent 8 of his $12. The house was tighter. The stove drew. The family had a place to sleep that did not leak when it rained, but the woodshed still held less than 3 cords, and 3 cords would not carry them to Christmas, let alone through January and February. Martin walked the property again. He walked it at dawn and at dusk, and sometimes in the middle of the night when Ada's coughing woke him and he could not return to sleep. He counted everything. The standing timber, which was sparse and far. The fencing, which could be burned in desperation, but then the cow would wander. The structure wood, which held the buildings upright. On the last night of September, he walked into the woodshed with a lantern. He had walked into it 100 times before, but this time, he carrying a load of kindling Noah had gathered. His boot caught a warped board. He stumbled. The board cracked. His leg went through the floor up to his hip. Martin dropped the kindling and the lantern and caught himself on his hands. For a moment he lay there, half in and half out of a hole, breathing hard. Then he pulled his leg free and retrieved the lantern and held it over the gap. The floor had rotted in a section near the north wall. But beneath the rotted boards there was not dirt. There was darkness, and the darkness was deeper than it should have been. Martin pulled 2 more boards free. The hole widened. He held the lantern lower and saw stone, limestone, hand-cut, laid in courses with mortar between them, a wall descending into the earth. He pulled more boards. The hole became an opening. The opening became a mouth. And Martin Vale found himself looking at a chamber that had been buried under his woodshed since before he arrived. The chamber was 8 feet wide, 10 feet long, and 7 feet deep at its lowest point. The walls were limestone, quarried and cut and fitted by someone who knew stonework. The floor was packed earth, dry and solid. The ceiling was timber, thick beams laid across the stone walls and covered with planking that had held against the weight of the woodshed floor for what looked like years. Martin lowered himself through the opening with the lantern in one hand. He stood in the chamber and turned in a slow circle. The air was cool, not cold like the October night above, but cool, still, unchanging. He held his hand near the stone wall and felt nothing. No draft, no movement. Ye of the chamber sat in the earth like something the world had forgotten. He climbed out and found a rope and lowered the lantern on the rope and examined every corner. The stone joints were tight. The mortar was old but solid. One section near what would have been a doorway showed some loosening, 3 courses where the stones had shifted slightly and the mortar had cracked. But the rest held true. Martin sat on the edge of the opening and looked down at the buried room. He thought about what Thorne had said, about digging holes, about freezing. Then he thought about something else, about a thing a mason had told him once back in Iowa years ago when Martin was helping lay the foundation for a spring house. The old man had said, "The earth forgives what air punishes." Martin had not understood then. Now he thought maybe he did. Osad, the air above ground moved. It carried heat away. It brought cold in. A house was just a box trying to stop the wind, and the wind always found a way through. But the earth did not move. The earth sat still, and still air held still temperature. He looked at the chamber again. 8 by 10 feet, 7 feet deep, stone walls that did not leak wind, an enclosed space that would take a fraction of the fuel to heat. If he could seal it, if he could vent it, if he could make it a place where people could stay and not suffocate, then maybe he would not need 10 cords of wood. Maybe he would not need 8. Maybe he would need just enough to heat one small room. Martin climbed out of the hole and walked back to the house. Ada was asleep. Noah was asleep. He sat at the table in the dark and drew diagrams on the back of a newspaper until the lantern burned dry. He told Ada in the morning. She listened without interrupting. When he finished, she said, "You want us to live in a hole in the ground?" "Not live, not all the time. Just when the worst cold comes, when the house cannot hold heat no matter how much wood we burn. Underground, like moles, like people who cannot afford to freeze." Ada was quiet. Her cough had improved over the past week. The roof patches and the new chinking had helped. She no longer woke every night shivering. What if the air turns bad? What if we cannot breathe? I will vent it. A pipe going up. A way for the smoke to leave and fresh air to come in. What if the roof falls? The roof has held for years. I will shore it with new timbers. What if Ada? Martin reached across the table and took her hands. I know every way this can go wrong. I've thought about them all night, but I've also thought about what happens if I do nothing. We do not have enough wood. We cannot get more wood. The house will not hold enough heat. These are not guesses. These are numbers. Ada looked at him for a long time. Then she said, Show me. He took her to the woodshed. He showed her the opening. He lowered the lantern and let her look at the stone walls, the solid floor, the timber ceiling. She studied it the way she studied a piece of cloth before cutting, looking for flaws, looking for weaknesses. Finally, she said, How do you know the stone will hold heat? The stone is not what holds heat. The earth is. The stone just keeps the earth from falling in. And you can put a stove down there? A small one, just enough to take the edge off. Ada pulled back from the opening. She wiped her hands on her apron. I do not like it, but I do not like freezing either. Is that a yes? That is a show me it works before you expect me to sleep in it. It was the most Martin could have hoped for. Jonah Pike arrived 2 days later. Pike farmed the quarter section northwest of Martin's claim. He was 41, practical, and skeptical of anything that sounded like cleverness. He'd come to borrow a draw knife and stayed to ask why Martin was pulling up the woodshed floor. Martin explained. Pike listened. When Martin finished, Pike walked to the edge of the opening and looked down. You found a root cellar, Pike said. I found a stone-lined chamber. It is bigger than a root cellar. People store turnips underground. They do not store children. People store turnips because the temperature underground stays steady, 40, 45 degrees year-round. That is not warm, but it is not 20 below either. Pike shook his head. You put a stove down there. You fill it with smoke. You cannot open a window. You cannot air it out. You will choke before you freeze. I will run a flue through the shed roof. The smoke goes up. A separate vent brings fresh air in. A flue through wood? Pike actually laughed. You will burn the shed down with yourself inside it. I will sleeve the pass-through, stone or brick around the pipe where it goes through the planking. And where will you get brick? Where will you get the money to buy it? I have clay from the creek bank. I have time. Pike stepped back from the opening. He looked at Martin with the expression of a man who has watched other men fail at ambitious plans. Thorne told me about you, Pike said. He said you came here with nothing and you think you can make something from it. He said you would learn, same as everyone else learns. Thorne buried his son in the winter of '81. He knows what cold can do, but that does not mean he knows every way to survive it. And you do? Martin did not answer directly. Instead, he said, How much wood do you have stacked? Pike hesitated. 7 cords, maybe 7.5. And your house? Log. 18 by 22. Tight chinked. 2 stoves. So you burn, 8 cords in a hard winter? 9 sometimes. 10 in '81. I have less than 3 cords. I have a frame house with gaps I cannot seal no matter how much mud I stuff into them. I have 1 stove and a wife with a cough that gets worse when she gets cold. Do you understand what that means? Pike said nothing. It means I cannot do what you do. It means the normal way is closed to me. So I have to find another way, even if it looks like foolishness to you. Pike was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, I'm not saying you are a fool. I'm saying that room is not a house. It is a cellar. People do not live in cellars. People do not live in 20 below either. They die in it. Pike left without the draw knife. Silas Bream came on a Tuesday. Bream was 47 years old, heavy through the shoulders, with a voice that carried across open ground like a church bell. He owned a woodlot 3 miles south and sold cordwood to half the claims in the district. He arrived in a wagon pulled by 2 draft horses, the bed stacked with oak rounds that Martin could not afford to buy. He stopped in front of the house and climbed down slowly. He looked at the woodshed with its torn-up floor. He looked at the pile of boards Martin had stacked near the barn. He looked at the hole in the ground and the ladder Martin had built to reach the chamber below. "I heard you found something under there," Bream said. Martin had been splitting kindling. He set the hatchet down. "Word travels. In a district this small, word does not have far to go." Bream walked toward the woodshed. He did not ask permission. "Pike says you think you can winter down there. Pike says you think a hole in the ground is better than a house." Pike said what he understood. "That is not the same as what I said." Bream stopped at the edge of the opening. He looked down at the chamber the way a man looks at a grave. "You found a root cellar, and you are calling it a miracle. I found a stone-lined chamber, and I'm calling it an option." An option. Bream turned and faced Martin. "Let me tell you about options. A man can buy wood, or he can cut wood, or he can burn wood someone else cut. Those are options. A man cannot crawl into the ground like a worm and call that living. A man can do whatever keeps his family alive. And when it does not work," Bream stepped closer. "When the air goes bad and you cannot breathe. When the roof gives and you are buried in your own hole. When your wife and your boy are trapped down there with no way out. What then?" Martin met his eyes. "Then I will have failed. The same as any man who runs out of wood and cannot keep his stove lit. The same as any man who freezes in a house that is supposed to protect him. The difference," Bream said, "is that the man in the house tried the right way and failed. You are not even trying the right way. You are trying something no one has ever done. Someone built that chamber. Someone cut and laid that stone. Someone tried, and someone left." Bream gestured at the abandoned property, the gaps in the house, the barn with no wall. "Someone tried whatever you're trying, and someone gave up and left. Does that not tell you something?" "It tells me the chamber survived. Whatever drove them off. It was not the chamber." Bream shook his head slowly. "You are going to get your family killed, and when you do, everyone will remember that Elias Thorne warned you. Jonah Pike warned you. I am warning you now. You found a grave and named it a room." He walked back to his wagon. Before climbing up, he turned and added, "When you are ready to buy wood like a reasonable man, you know where to find me, though by November, the price goes up." Martin watched him drive away. The wagon wheels cut ruts in the soft ground. The oak rounds in the bed represented more warmth than Martin could afford. He picked up the hatchet and went back to splitting kindling. Tell us in the comments, have you ever been doubted by someone who only understood the usual way of doing things? The work began in earnest on the 5th of October. Martin cleared the chamber completely. He carried out the old straw that had been stored there, the broken crates, the rusted tools left behind by the previous owner. He swept the packed earth floor until it was clean. He ran his hands along every stone joint, pressing, testing, looking for weakness. The 3 loosened courses near the old doorway worried him most. The stones had shifted perhaps half an inch over the years. The mortar had cracked, and in 2 places had fallen out entirely. Water could seep through those gaps. Cold could creep through. Worse, the stones themselves might continue to shift until the whole section failed. He needed someone who knew stone. He needed help he could not afford to pay for. On the 7th of October, that help arrived wearing a coat patched in 6 places and carrying a sack of kindling to sell. Your Asa Mercer was 58 years old. He had worked stone since he was 14, quarry labor first, then bridge abutments for the railroad, then spring houses and cellar walls and anything else that needed to last longer than the man who built it. He had come west in '79 after his wife died of cholera, and his employer went bankrupt in the same season. Now he lived in a soddy 3 miles south and sold kindling to people who had more money than time. He knocked on the door and Ada answered. He offered the kindling for 20 cents. She said they could not afford it. He nodded and was about to leave when he noticed the torn-up woodshed floor and the ladder descending into darkness. "What is that?" he asked. Ada explained. Mercer listened, but then he walked to the opening and looked down at the stone walls with the expression of a man who has found something he thought he would never see again. "Who built this?" Ada said she did not know. Neither did Martin, who had come out from behind the house where he had been digging clay from the creek bed. Mercer lowered himself down the ladder without asking permission. He was underground for 10 minutes. When he came back up, his hands were dusty and his eyes were bright. "The man who built this knew what he was doing. The coursing is true. The joints are tight. He quarried local limestone, I can tell by the color, and he cut it with hand tools, not a powered saw. This is old work, maybe 12, 15 years. "Is it sound?" Martin asked. "Mostly." Mercer wiped his hands on his trousers. 3 courses near where the stairs should be need repointing. The mortar has cracked and 1 stone has slipped. Leave it long enough and water will get behind the wall and freeze and push the whole section out. But fix it now and it will hold for another 50 years. "Can you teach me to fix it?" Mercer looked at Martin. Really looked, the way Thorne had looked, but without the despair. Instead, there was something like curiosity. "Why are you doing this? Why not just use it for storage like it was meant for?" Martin explained. "The wood, the wife, the winter that was coming and the numbers that would not add up no matter how many times he counted them." Mercer listened without interrupting. When Martin finished, Mercer said, You want to turn a root cellar into a storm shelter?" "I want to turn it into a place where my family can survive when the house cannot protect them." "With a stove?" "A small one, flue through the roof, separate vent for air. You will need to sleeve the pass-through with stone, clay brick if you can fire it. Otherwise the wood will char and eventually catch." "I know. Can you teach me?" Mercer was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I'm not looking for charity work. I sell kindling because I need to eat. I cannot pay you money. I have $4 left and most of that is spoken for. But I can trade labor. I can help you with whatever work you need done, after winter, after I know my family will survive." "After winter's a long time from now." "Yes, it is." Mercer looked at the chamber opening again. He looked at the house with its patched roof and stuff chinking. He looked at the woodshed with barely 3 cords stacked inside. "I buried 2 men under a bridge abutment in '74, he said quietly. "The stone shifted while they were working underneath. I was on top. I heard them shouting. By the time we moved enough to reach them, they were gone." Martin did not know what to say. "I have been careful about stone ever since. I do not work with men who cut corners. I do not work with men who think they know better than the material." Mercer met Martin's eyes. "But I also do not walk away from work that deserves to be finished. Whoever started that chamber knew what he was doing. He did not finish it because something drove him off this claim. That is not the stone's fault. Meaning that stone deserves to be used." "Does that mean you will help?" Mercer picked up his sack of kindling. "It means I will come back tomorrow with tools. Whether I help depends on how you handle those tools." He walked away without looking back. The next morning, Mercer arrived with a mason's hammer, 3 chisels, a pointing trowel, and a bucket of lime that he had mixed himself from shells burned in a pit behind his soddy. Martin was waiting at the chamber opening. "First lesson," Mercer said. "You do not fix stone. You convince stone to stay where it wants to be. Stone has weight and stone has will. Your job is to understand both." They descended the ladder together. Mercer knelt at the damaged section and ran his fingers along the cracked mortar. "Feel this," he said. Martin knelt beside him. He touched the gap where the mortar had failed. It was wider than his finger. Water came through here. Freeze and thaw, freeze and thaw. Each cycle the crack grows. Eventually the stone moves. Mercer pointed to the shifted block. "See how it has dropped? A quarter inch, maybe less, but that quarter inch pulls on the stone above it, and that stone pulls on the one above, and eventually the whole section leans. How do we stop it? We remove the damaged mortar. We reset the shifted stone. We repoint every joint in this section with new lime, and we do it right, because if we do it wrong, we make it worse." The work took 3 days. Mercer taught Martin to chip out old mortar without damaging the stone beneath. He taught him to mix lime with sand and just enough water to make it workable. He taught him to press the new mortar into the joints with the trowel held at an angle, forcing the mix deep before smoothing the surface. "Do not hurry," Mercer said when Martin tried to move faster. "Hurry is how men die underground." By the end of the 3rd day, the damaged section was solid. Martin pressed his palm against the reset stone and felt nothing but firmness. "That will hold," Mercer said. "Longer than either of us will be around to see it fail." But the stonemasonry was only the beginning. The stove came from a hardware auction in Beatrice, a cast-iron box stove small enough to fit through the chamber opening, with a cracked leg that Martin repaired with wire wrapping and a missing ash grate that he replaced with a piece of heavy iron mesh. The stove cost him $1.50. The pipe sections cost another 80 cents. He was down to his last $1.70, and he had not yet solved the problem of the pass-through. Mercer studied the chamber ceiling. The timber beams were solid, dry, seasoned by years in the ground. The planking above them formed the floor of the woodshed. The shed roof peaked 12 feet above ground level. "You run the pipes straight up," Mercer said. "Through the planking, through the shed, out the roof. Shortest path, best draw. And where it goes through the wood? You cut a hole larger than the pipe. You fill that hole with something that does not burn. Clay brick is best. Mortared stone will work. If you had nothing else, packed wet clay would hold for a while, but it cracks when it dries." Martin had spent days digging clay from the creek bank. He had pressed it into forms made from scrap lumber and let it dry in the October sun. The bricks were crude, uneven, crumbly at the edges, but they were clay, and clay did not burn. "Will these work?" Mercer picked up one of the bricks and turned it over in his hands. He pressed it with his thumb. A piece broke off. "They are not fired. They will crumble over time. But if you make enough of them and pack them tight and keep them dry, they might hold for a season." He set the brick down. "Make more, twice as many as you think you need. And when spring comes, we fire them properly." Martin made more bricks. He dug more clay. He mixed it with straw for binding and pressed it into forms until his hands cracked and bled from the work. By the end of the week, he had 60 bricks stacked beside the woodshed. See, the pass-through took 2 days to build. They cut a hole in the chamber ceiling, 6 inches wider than the stovepipe. They cut a matching hole in the shed floor above. They set the clay bricks in a ring around the opening, mortaring them with the same lime Mercer had used for the stone walls. They ran the pipe from the stove collar, up through the brick sleeve, through the shed, and out a hole cut in the roof. On the 20th of October, Martin lit the first test fire. Smoke poured from every joint. The pipe connections leaked. The stove door did not seal properly. The draw was wrong. The fire burned weak and sullen, and the smoke that should have risen through the pipe instead billowed into the chamber until Martin's eyes watered and his lungs burned. He climbed out coughing. Ada handed him a cup of water and said nothing. A submerser came the next day. He looked at the connections, felt the draw, watched the fire behavior. "The pipe has gaps," he said, "where the sections meet. The smoke finds those gaps before it finds the flue." "How do I seal them?" "Furnace cement, or clay slip, or mud if you have nothing else. Something that fills the gaps and hardens when it heats." Martin mixed clay with water until it was thin as cream. He painted it over every joint. He sealed the door edges with rope gasket soaked in lime water. He adjusted the damper. The second test fire burned cleaner. The smoke rose. The chamber warmed. But Martin noticed something else. The air quality changed after an hour. His head ached. His thoughts slowed. The fire was drawing the good air, and not enough was coming in to replace it. "You need a vent," Mercer said. A separate path for air to enter. Otherwise, the fire eats what you need to breathe." They cut a second hole in the chamber ceiling. This one they did not sleeve with brick. They ran a simple wooden pipe through the woodshed floor and up through a second hole in the roof. A flap of leather at the top kept rain out. A second flap at the bottom could be opened or closed to control the flow. The third test fire burned clean, and Martin's head did not ache. By the 1st of November, the chamber was ready. Shelves lined the back wall. Rough-cut planks supported by stone brackets Mercer had helped him set into the mortar. On the shelves sat flour, cornmeal, salt pork, dried beans, lamp oil, candles, and 4 jars of the preserved plums Ada's mother had given them when they left Iowa. A water bucket sat near the base of the ladder. Wee blankets lay folded in the corner. A rope hung coiled near the stove, the escape rope, Martin called it, in case the ladder ever failed. The weather had turned. Frost crept across the grass each morning. The creek bank where Martin had dug clay now held a skim of ice until noon. He brought Ada down to see the finished chamber. She stood in the center and looked at the stone walls, the shelves, the stove with its pipe rising through the brick sleeve. The air was cool, but not cold. 45 degrees, Martin guessed, warmer than the house on many mornings. "It is small," Ada said. "It is warm. When the stove is lit, it will be warmer." She touched the stone wall. "It feels like a grave." "It is not a grave. It is a shelter, a place the wind cannot reach." "And if something goes wrong? What if the air turns bad or the roof falls?" "Then we climb out. The ladder is right there. The hatch is right above. We are 7 feet underground, not 70. Ada stood there for a long time. Then she said, "I do not want to need this place." "Neither do I. But we might." She climbed the ladder and did not look back. That night, the temperature dropped to 14 degrees. Martin woke at 3 in the morning with Ada shivering beside him. The house had lost its heat despite the stove still burning. The gaps in the walls, gaps he had stuffed and sealed and stuffed again, were letting cold air pour through. He added wood to the stove. He wrapped Ada in another blanket. He sat by the fire and watched his breath turn to fog and wondered how much worse it would get. In the morning, he found ice on the inside of the window, when the water bucket had frozen solid. He walked to the woodshed and climbed down into the chamber. The temperature was 43 degrees. He had not lit the stove down here in 2 days, and still the chamber held more warmth than the house above. The earth forgives what air punishes. Martin climbed back up into the cold and looked at the sky. Gray clouds stretched to every horizon. The wind had teeth. 4 cords of wood remained in the shed. Maybe 4.5 if he counted the green oak that still would not burn clean. It was not enough for the house. He knew that now. Thorne had been right about the numbers, but maybe, just maybe, it was enough for the chamber, if the worst came. If the cold that was coming turned into the kind of cold that killed. If the house failed and the only choice was down. He had built an option. Whether that option would save them or bury them, he would not know until the moment came to use it. The first real test was still ahead. And the winter had barely begun. November came with a cruelty that surprised even Elias Thorne. The old man appeared at Martin's claim on the 3rd day of the month, walking the half-mile from his property through air that bit exposed skin within minutes. He did not knock this time either. He walked directly to the woodshed and stood at the opening and looked down at the chamber Martin had built. Martin was inside, adjusting the stove damper. He looked up to see Thorne's face framed by the hatch opening, backlit by gray sky. "Pike told me what you were doing," Thorne said. I did not believe him. Martin climbed the ladder. He stood facing Thorne in the cold wind. "Hey, now you see." Thorne said nothing for a long moment. Then he descended the ladder himself, moving carefully, his old joints protesting each rung. Martin followed. In the chamber, Thorne turned in a slow circle. He touched the stone walls. He examined the stove, the flue, the vent pipe, the shelves stocked with provisions. He knelt and pressed his palm to the packed earth floor. He looked at the brick sleeve where the stovepipe passed through the ceiling. "Who taught you stonework?" "Asa Mercer. He lives in a soddy south of here. He worked railroad bridges before he came west." "I know Mercer. He's good at what he does." Thorne stood and brushed dirt from his knees. "This is not foolishness. I thought it was. I was wrong about that part. But winter is not a single night. Winter is 90 days of cold that finds every weakness. You have built a shelter that works on a November morning. That does not mean it will work in January. What would you have me do differently?" Thorne walked to the shelves. He counted the supplies. He lifted a jar of preserved plums and set it down. He measured the flour sack with his eyes. "More food. You have enough for perhaps 2 weeks if all 3 of you stay down here. A bad storm can pin you for 4 days. 2 bad storms back to back can pin you for 10. You need more. I cannot afford more." "Then you find another way to get it." Thorne climbed the ladder. At the top, he turned and looked down. "I told you your wife would freeze. I still believe that is possible, but you have done more than I expected, more than most men would try." It was not an apology. It was not a blessing. But it was something Martin had not heard before from Elias Thorne. Acknowledgement. The second week of November brought the first real snow. It started at dawn on a Tuesday and did not stop for 31 hours. When it ended, drifts stood 4 feet high against the north side of the house. The road to Beatrice vanished. The world became white silence broken only by wind. Martin spent the first day after the storm digging out. The house had held its heat better than he expected. The latest round of chinking had helped, but he had burned nearly half a cord keeping the stove fed through the blizzard. At that rate, his remaining wood would last 6 weeks, maybe 7. January was 10 weeks away. He began rationing, smaller fires, more blankets. The family spent more time in bed, conserving warmth with their bodies. Ada's cough returned, though not as badly as before. Noah complained that he could see his breath when he woke in the morning. On the 4th day after the storm, Martin made a decision. He climbed down into the chamber and lit the stove there for the first time since the test fires. He let it burn for 3 hours. The temperature rose from 44 degrees to 58. Then he banked the fire and let it die. The next morning, the chamber was still 51 degrees. The house, with its stove burned down overnight, was 34. The earth held heat the way the house could not. Mercer came every few days through November. He brought kindling when he could spare it and advice when he could not. Together, he and Martin refined the chamber. They added a second layer of clay bricks around the stove pass-through for insurance against the heat, eventually cracking the first layer. They built a small platform near the ladder base so wet boots could dry without soaking the earth floor. They hung hooks from the ceiling beams for lanterns and extra clothing. One afternoon, while Martin was sealing a gap in the vent pipe with clay slip, Mercer sat on an overturned bucket and told him about the railroad. "We built a bridge across the Republican River in '73. 400 feet of stone arch, 12 feet above high water. Took us 9 months, 43 men. I was the youngest." "What was the hardest part?" "Keeping the center pier dry while we laid the foundation. The river wanted that pier. It rose twice during construction and nearly took 3 men with it." Mercer paused. "But the part that killed people was not the water. It was the stone. The men thought they knew where a block would go. They would position themselves in the wrong place, and a 500-pound piece of limestone would shift before the mortar set." "Is that how you lost the 2 men you mentioned?" Mercer nodded slowly. "I was on top of the abutment, measuring for the next course. They were below, checking the joint on a block we had just placed. The mortar was still wet. The block moved. By the time I got down there, the weight had crushed them both." Martin set down the clay slip. "You blame yourself." "I measured that block myself. I told them the position was good. It was good until it was not." Mercer looked at the stone walls surrounding them. "Stone does not care about your intentions. Stone does what weight and pressure and time demand. You can work with it. No, you cannot command it." "But you kept working stone after that." "What else was I going to do? Hate the thing I understood best?" Mercer stood and walked to the wall Martin had repaired. He ran his hand along the joints. "This work is good. Solid. If the ceiling falls, it will not be because the walls gave way." "That is reassuring." "It is the truth. Whether it is reassuring depends on what keeps you awake at night." By the end of November, Martin had developed a system. The family slept in the house most nights, burning small fires that kept the temperature above freezing, but no higher. On the coldest nights, when the wind howled and the stove could not keep up, they moved to the chamber. Ada had stopped calling it a grave. Now she called it below, as in, "The wind is bad. We should sleep below tonight." Noah adapted faster than either parent. He treated the chamber like an adventure, a secret cave where the rules were different. He kept a collection of interesting stones on the lowest shelf, gathered from the creek bed before the freeze. He had named the stove Old Tom after a mule he remembered from Iowa. The wood supply dwindled. Martin counted the cords, and every week, then every few days, then every morning. 4 cords became 3.5. 3.5 became 3. The math pressed against him constantly, but the math had changed. The chamber needed less fuel than the house. A small fire burned for 2 hours would warm the space enough to last through the night. The stone walls did not leak cold the way the wooden walls did. The earth, 50 feet in every direction, held its temperature like a blanket wrapped around them. Martin began to believe they might make it. December brought Silas Bream back to the claim. He came in his wagon, again loaded with oak rounds, and again he stopped in front of the house and climbed down with the deliberate slowness of a man who knows he is being watched. Martin was splitting what remained of the green oak from the woodshed pile. The axe was dull. He had not had time to sharpen it properly, and each stroke took more effort than it should. "Still here," Bream said. It was not a question. "Still here." Pike says you have been living in that cellar of yours. Some nights, when the house cannot hold heat. Bream walked toward the woodshed. Martin set down the axe and followed. The pile inside had shrunk visibly since October. 3 cords, maybe a little more. Dear Bream looked at it and shook his head. You are burning slower than anyone I have seen, but you are still burning. By February, you will have nothing left. By February, the worst will be past. Will it? Bream turned to face him. January is not December. January is when the real cold comes. The cold that kills cattle standing in their own barns. The cold that freezes a man's lungs while he walks from the house to the privy. I know what January is. Do you? Have you lived through a Nebraska January? Have you seen what happens when the temperature drops 40 degrees in an afternoon and stays there for a week? Martin did not answer. I will tell you what happens. Men who thought they were prepared discover they are not. Men who rationed carefully find they rationed wrong. Men who trusted their walls and their stoves and their calculations find that the cold does not care about any of it. Bream stepped closer. You are gambling on a hole in the ground. When the real cold comes, that gamble will be called. Then I will answer it. With what? 3 cords of wood and a stone box? With whatever I have. Bream shook his head again. I'm offering you a fair price. $4 a cord delivered. Buy 2 cords now and you might have a chance. I do not have $8. Then sell something. Sell the cow. Sell the wagon. Sell whatever you have to sell. If I sell the cow, we have no milk. If I sell the wagon, I cannot haul anything. If I sell everything I own, I will survive this winter and starve next spring. At least you would see spring. Martin looked at the woodpile. He looked at the chamber opening. He looked at Bream, who stood there with his wagon full of wood and his certainty that everyone else was doing it wrong. I have an option you do not understand, Martin said. I have a room that holds heat when this house bleeds it. I have walls that do not answer to the wind. I have a space small enough that a handful of wood will warm it for a night. You see a hole in the ground. I see a chance. I see a coffin with shelves. Then stop looking. Bream left without selling a single round. Martin watched him drive away, then went back to splitting the green oak with his dull axe Christmas Day, 1887. The family ate salt pork and cornmeal mush and a single jar of the preserved plums from Iowa. Ada led them in a carol she remembered from her childhood, her voice rough from the cough that never quite left. Noah received a carved wooden horse that Martin had made from a piece of scrap lumber during the long November nights. They spent the day in the house, the stove burning steadily, the temperature outside hovering near 0. It was cold, but it was manageable cold, the kind of cold you could fight with fire and blankets and staying inside. That night, after Noah was asleep, Ada sat beside Martin near the stove. We will make it, she said. Do not say that yet. I'm saying it anyway. I did not believe you when you started this. I thought you were building something we would never use, wasting time we could not spare. But I was wrong. We are not through January yet. No, but we are closer than I thought we would be. She leaned against him. Whatever happens, but you tried something. You did not just wait to freeze. Martin put his arm around her. The fire crackled. Outside, the wind moved across the frozen grass and rattled the window frame. Mercer says the stone will hold, Martin said. He says the work is solid. And the air? The fire in a closed room? The vent works. I have tested it a dozen times. As long as we keep the flue clear and the intake open, the air stays good. And if something goes wrong, then we climb out, 7 feet.
less than the height of two men standing on each other's shoulders. We are not trapped. Ada was quiet for a moment. Then she said, I used to dream about the house we would have, the house we would build together someday. It had 2 floors and a proper staircase and a parlor for receiving guests. We can still have that house. I know, but first we have to survive a room in the ground. It is strange, is it not? The path to everything we want leads through a cellar. The path leads through winter. The cellar is just how we walk it. She kissed his cheek and went to bed. Martin stayed by the stove a while longer, watching the flames, counting the wood remaining, calculating the days until the worst would pass. He did not know that the worst was 20 days away. January arrived cold. Not the killing cold, not yet, but cold that pressed against the house like a weight, cold that turned breath to ice crystals before it left the mouth, cold that made every step outside an act of endurance. Martin burned wood sparingly. He spent nights in the chamber when the house dropped below 28 degrees, dragging blankets and water and Noah's carved horse down the ladder while Ada carried the lantern. On those nights, they slept on a pallet of straw covered with quilts, the stove burning low, the temperature holding in the low 50s while the world above them froze. The routine had become almost normal. Noah no longer complained about the chamber. Ada's cough had improved since they started spending nights in the warmer air below. Martin had learned to read the weather by the way the vent pipe whistled. A high note meant clear and cold. A low moan meant wind coming. On the morning of January 11th, the wind was silent. Martin climbed the ladder and pushed open the hatch. The air that greeted him was warm. Not spring warm, not even October warm, but warm enough that his breath did not freeze immediately. Or did the sun shone from a sky that held only scattered clouds. He checked the thermometer he had nailed to the shed wall. 38 degrees, warmer than it had been in 6 weeks. Noah ran outside without his coat, and Martin let him. Ada came to the doorway and stood there with her face tilted up to the sun, eyes closed, breathing air that did not burn. It is a thaw, she said. False thaw. It will not last. I know, but let me have it anyway. Martin spent the day checking the property. The drifts had softened. Water dripped from the eaves. The cow, penned in what remained of the barn, stood in a patch of sunlight and looked almost content. By afternoon, the temperature had risen to 41. Pike came by to borrow a handsaw. The warmth had made him ambitious about trimming some deadfall, and he stayed to talk. Strange weather, Pike said. Feels like March. It is not March. It is January. I know what month it is. I'm saying it feels wrong. Martin looked at the sky. The clouds had thickened in the west, but they were high clouds, not the low gray masses that brought snow. It will turn, he said. It always turns. Thorne says the same thing. He says the worst storms come after a thaw. Something about the warm air drawing in cold behind it. Thorne would know. Pike left with the saw. Martin went back to work, patching a gap in the barn wall where the cow's warmth escaped. He worked until dusk, enjoying the rare pleasure of labor without freezing hands. That night, the family slept in the house. The temperature stayed above freezing. The stove barely needed feeding. Ada slept without coughing. Noah dreamed whatever boys dream about when the world briefly stops trying to kill them. Martin woke once, near midnight, with a strange feeling he could not name. He went to the window and looked out. The sky was clear. The stars burned cold and bright. He went back to bed. January 12th began as the warmest day since November. By 9 in the morning, the temperature had climbed to 44 degrees. Water ran from every surface. The road to Beatrice, which had been a white track through white fields for weeks, showed patches of brown mud. Birds sang. The sun shone with a warmth that felt almost insulting after the cold that had come before. Noah asked if he could walk to the Pike's claim to return the hand saw. Martin said yes. The boy left at 10, the saw over his shoulder, now walking the half-mile with his coat unbuttoned and his hat in his pocket. Ada washed clothes for the first time in 3 weeks, hanging them on the line outside, where they would actually dry instead of freeze solid. Martin hauled water from the well. The surface ice had melted, making the work easier, and stacked it in buckets near the house and the chamber both. At 11, the wind shifted. Martin felt it first as a change in pressure, a tightening in his ears like the feeling before a thunderstorm. Then the warmth drained from the air, not slowly, not gradually, but all at once, like a door slamming shut. He looked west. The sky had changed. The high scattered clouds were gone. In their place, a wall of gray-brown darkness rose from the horizon, taller than anything Martin had ever seen, moving toward them with a speed that defied belief. He did not think. He ran. Ada! He hit the door at full sprint. Ada, get to the cellar, now! She was at the wash tub. She looked up, confused. What? Now. Do not ask. Just move. He grabbed her arm and pulled her toward the woodshed. The wind hit as they crossed the yard. Not a gust, but a wall, a physical force that staggered them both. The temperature dropped 10 degrees in the time it took to reach the shed. Get down, Martin shouted over the roar. Get below and stay there. Ada descended the ladder. Martin looked toward the Pike's claim. Noah. The boy was somewhere between here and there, walking home with a saw, in a coat he had unbuttoned because the morning was warm. The wall of cloud swallowed the sun. Martin could not see 20 feet. The snow did not fall. It drove sideways, horizontal, a white blindness that erased the world. The wind screamed. The temperature plunged. He could feel it dropping, degree by degree, second by second, the warmth bleeding from his body faster than his blood could replace it. He grabbed the rope he kept coiled by the cellar entrance, the safety rope, the one he had laughed about needing, and tied one end to the shed door frame. Then he wrapped the other end around his waist and walked into the white. 10 steps, and the shed disappeared. 20 steps, and he could not have pointed to the house. The snow bit his face. His ears burned and then went numb. His fingers, gloveless, began to stiffen. Noah! His voice vanished into the wind. Noah! He walked the length of the rope, 40 feet, and hit the end. He stood there shouting the boy's name into a wall of white that gave nothing back. Think. The Pike's claim was northwest. Noah had left at 10. He would have reached there by 10:30. If he started back immediately, he would be where? Halfway? Closer? Martin untied the rope from his waist. He tied a loop in it, slipped it over a fence post, and walked another 40 feet into the blizzard. He was burning time. He was burning heat. Every second he spent out here was a second he might not be able to buy back. But his son was somewhere in this whiteness. His 9-year-old son with an unbuttoned coat, walking home with a handsaw. Noah! The wind swallowed everything. Martin walked another 20 feet. He could no longer feel his hands. His face was a mask of ice. His legs moved, but he could not tell if he was walking forward or in circles. Then, through the roar, he heard something. A voice. Thin, small, barely audible above the wind, coming from his left. Martin turned and walked toward it. 5 steps. 10. The voice grew louder. Pa! He nearly tripped over the boy. Noah was on his hands and knees in a drift, the saw still clutched in his frozen fingers. His coat was buttoned now. He had tried to button it when the wind came, but his hands were bare and his ears were white with the beginnings of frostbite. Martin picked him up without a word. He threw the boy over his shoulder and turned back toward where he thought the rope was. His legs barely obeyed. His lungs burned with cold air. He walked. He walked for what felt like an hour, but was probably 2 minutes. Then his foot caught something, the fence post, the loop of rope, and he grabbed the line and followed it back toward the shed. The woodshed materialized out of the white. Martin kicked the door open and fell through it with Noah still on his shoulder. He crawled to the cellar hatch and lowered the boy through. "Take him," he shouted down to Ada, his hands, warm as hands. Then he climbed down after them and pulled the hatch closed against the screaming wind. If you're invested in this story, stay with us, because what happens next will test everything Martin has built. The chamber held. The wind roared above them, a continuous howl that vibrated through the timbers and rattled the stovepipe in its brick sleeve. But the sound was muffled, distant. The fury of the blizzard reached them as a rumor, not a fact. Martin lit the stove with shaking hands. He could barely grip the matches. His fingers had gone from numb to burning, the blood returning to tissue that had nearly died. Ada worked on Noah's hands, rubbing them between her palms, breathing warm air onto his frozen fingers. The boy whimpered, but did not cry. His ears were white, then red, then a mottled purple as circulation returned. "Will he lose them?" Ada asked without looking up. "His fingers?" "I do not know." Martin finally got the fire started. The kindling caught. He added larger pieces. "I do not think so. We found him fast. If you had not gone out, do not think about that." The stove began to heat the chamber. 50 degrees, 55. The cold that had followed them down began to retreat. Above them, the blizzard screamed. The first hour was the worst, as the wind did not diminish. The temperature, which had been dropping when Martin crawled down the ladder, continued to fall. The stovepipe moaned and whistled as the pressure differential between the chamber and the surface tried to pull the warm air up. Martin adjusted the damper. He closed the vent halfway, then 3/4. The air in the chamber thickened slightly, but not enough to be dangerous. The stove drew well. The smoke rose. Noah's color returned. His fingers, which had been waxy white, flushed pink and then red. He sat on the pallet wrapped in every blanket they owned, sipping warm water that Ada had heated on the stovetop. "I saw it coming," Noah said, his voice small. "I was walking home and I saw the sky turn brown. I tried to run." "You did well," Martin said. "You moved toward home. That is how I found you. I could not see anything. I could not tell which way to go. I know, neither could I. But I found you." "How?" Martin looked at the rope burns on his hands, already blistering. "I followed a line I had prepared, and then I followed your voice." Ada sat down beside them. For a long moment, no one spoke. The stove crackled. The wind screamed. The temperature in the chamber held at 56 degrees, while the world above them froze. "How cold is it?" Ada asked. Martin checked the thermometer he had hung near the ladder. 54 in the chamber. He climbed halfway up the ladder and pushed the hatch open 2 inches. The cold that hit him was beyond cold. It was a physical force, a violence of air that burned his face in the instant of contact. He let the hatch fall closed and descended. "I do not know exactly. Below 0, 20 below, maybe more." "And we are safe here?" "We are alive here. For now, that is enough." The second hour brought company, a pounding on the hatch, a voice muffled by wood and wind shouting something Martin could not make out. He climbed the ladder and cracked the hatch. The face that appeared in the gap was crusted with ice, the eyes barely visible through frozen lashes. Jonah Pike. Martin hauled him through the opening and down the ladder. Pike collapsed at the bottom, shaking so violently he could not speak. "My God," Ada said. "Jonah." "The house," Pike managed through chattering teeth. "The walls. The wind came through the walls. I could not keep the fire hot enough." Martin stripped off Pike's coat and wrapped him in a blanket. Ada poured warm water. The man drank. "You're spilling half of it," because his hands would not stop shaking. "Where is your family?" Martin asked. "Alone. I live alone." Pike looked at them with eyes that had seen his own death. The whole settlement will freeze tonight." "Not the whole settlement." "You do not understand. The wind, the cold. It is not like anything." Pike broke off, overwhelmed. Thorne was right about everything, about the cold that kills. Thorne was right about some things, not about everything. Pike looked around the chamber for the first time. He saw the stone walls, the stove, the shelves of food, the lantern casting warm light. He saw a room that held 54 degrees while the world above died. "You built it," he said. "You actually built it. Help me reinforce the hatch, then rest." The third hour brought another voice. On this one Martin recognized. Even muffled, even half strangled by wind, he knew the cadence. Silas Bream. Martin climbed the ladder and opened the hatch. Bream stood there with frost on his beard and one ear torn ragged by the cold. Behind him, barely visible in the driving snow, stood a younger man Martin did not know. "My hired man!" Bream shouted over the wind. "We were hauling wood when it hit. The horses bolted. We cannot find them." Martin looked at the man who had called his shelter a coffin, the man who had predicted his family would die, the man who had come to sell overpriced wood and left mocking the alternative. "Come down," Martin said. Bream descended. The hired man followed. Both were shaking. Both were half frozen. Both stood in the chamber looking at the stone walls and the warm stove with expressions Martin had never expected to see on their faces. Gratitude and shame. "How long will this last?" Bream asked. "I do not know. The storm or the cellar?" "Either. The storm, hours, maybe days. The cellar will last as long as we need it to." Bream said nothing. He stood by the stove and held his damaged ear and stared at the flames. Martin counted. 6 people now in a room built for 3. The air would thin faster. The food would stretch less far. The water would need replenishing, but he could not replenish it while the blizzard raged. "How is the draw?" Pike asked. He had recovered enough to think practically. 6 people breathing. Slower than it should be, but still drawing. Martin adjusted the vent. "We watch for headaches. Here we watch for confusion. If the air turns bad, we crack the hatch no matter how cold it is." "That could kill us." "Bad air will definitely kill us. The cold only might." The blizzard lasted 19 hours. Martin tracked time by the burning of candles. Each candle lasted approximately 4 hours. He lit the first one at 2 in the afternoon when the storm hit. He lit the 5th at 6 in the morning when the wind finally began to subside. 19 hours in a stone room with 5 other people, a single stove, and air that came through a vent 6 inches wide. They slept in shifts, 2 awake, 4 sleeping. The ones awake watched the fire, watched the vent, watched each other for signs of oxygen deprivation. Martin and Pike took the first shift. Ada and Bream took the second. The hired man, whose name Martin learned, where he was Thomas, took a shift alone while everyone else rested. Noah slept through most of it. His fingers had not blackened. His ears had not blistered. Whatever damage the cold had done, it had not been permanent. At dawn, Martin climbed the ladder and pushed the hatch open. The wind had died. The snow had stopped. The world above was white and silent, and so cold that the moisture in his nose froze solid with his first breath. He checked the thermometer, 36 below zero. He closed the hatch and descended. "It is over," he said. "The storm. But the cold is still killing cold. We stay here until the sun warms things up." No one argued. They emerged at 10 in the morning. The temperature had risen to 12 below, still dangerous, but no longer instantly fatal. Martin went first, then Pike, then Bream and Thomas. So while Ada stayed below with Noah until the others could assess the damage. The house was standing. The roof had held. But when Martin opened the door, he found the interior filled with snow. Drifts had pushed through the gaps in the walls, the same gaps he had stuffed and sealed and stuffed again. The stove was buried. The table was buried. The place where they had slept, where they had eaten, where they had lived, all of it was white. If they had been inside when the storm hit, they would be dead. Martin walked to the woodshed. The structure had held. The hatch had held. But the drifts had piled against the north side 10 feet high. Pike stood beside him, looking at the snow. "I told you people do not live in cellars," Pike said quietly. "I told you it was for storing turnips." "You did. I was wrong. You were cautious." "There is a difference." Pike shook his head. "There is not. Not last night. Last night caution would have killed me." Bream emerged from checking on the barn. His face was grim. "The cow is alive. Barely. She was standing in the corner with her back to the wind and the snow piled up around her. She will survive, but she is not in good shape." "Better than dead," Martin said. "Yes, better than dead." Bream looked at the cellar entrance. "I called that room a coffin. I remember." "It is not a coffin." Bream paused. He seemed to be struggling with something. "My hired man would be dead if not for that room. I would be dead. Pike would be dead. Your family would be dead. Everyone who sheltered there is alive because you dug a hole that I said would kill you. I did not dig it. I found it. I just made it usable." "You made it usable, and I told you not to waste your time. I told you to buy wood for me instead." Bream's voice cracked slightly. "I have sold wood to 20 families in this district. This morning, I do not know how many of those families are still alive." Martin said nothing. There was nothing to say. The count came in over the next 3 days. Elias Thorne had survived. His house, better built than most, had held the wind. He had burned nearly a cord of wood in 19 hours, but he had made it through. The Hendersons, a family with 4 children 3 miles north, had lost their youngest, a girl, 6 years old. She had frozen in her bed while her parents tried to keep the fire alive in a stove that could not compete with the wind. A hired man named Olson, working a claim south of Pikes, Dee had walked outside to check on livestock when the storm hit. They found his body 2 days later, half a mile from the house, facing the wrong direction. A widow named Margit Stensland had survived because she owned a sod house. The earth walls held the heat. She had burned through her wood supply, but the thick walls bought her time the frame houses could not. In Beatrice, the school had held children when the storm hit. The teacher had kept them inside, burning desks and chairs when the wood pile ran out. All survived. But in the countryside, in the scattered claims where families lived alone, and the nearest neighbor was a mile through impossible snow, the dying had been easy. They called it the Children's Blizzard. 300 dead across the plains. Some said 400. The count kept rising as spring revealed what winter had hidden. Martin listened to the reports. He helped dig out neighbors. He said little about the cellar because what was there to say? He had built an option. The option had worked. Saying more felt like boasting over graves. But the neighbors talked. Pike talked. Bream talked. Thomas talked.
and within a week people started coming to see the room under the woodshed that had saved 6 lives while the blizzard killed hundreds. The first visitor arrived on the 4th day after the blizzard. His name was Halvor Tveit, a Norwegian homesteader from a claim 8 miles northwest. He had lost 2 horses and a milk cow in the storm. His family had survived because his wife had insisted they sleep in the dugout portion of their house, the original shelter from their first year, one which they had been using as a root cellar since building the frame addition. Tveit stood at the edge of the chamber opening and looked down at the stone walls. "Pike told me about this," he said. "I did not believe him." Most people did not. My wife believed. She said if the Vales could make a cellar into a shelter, we should look at our dugout differently. Tveit paused. She was right. The dugout saved us. The frame house would have killed us. The earth holds what the air takes. Tveit nodded slowly. "I want to know how you did this. The stove, the vent, the way you keep the air clean. I want to build something like it, better than what we have." Martin climbed down the ladder and showed him everything. The second visitor came the next day. Then 2 more the day after that. By the end of the week, Martin had walked 7 different people through the chamber, explaining the same things each time. The brick sleeve around the stovepipe, the separate vent for fresh air, the depth that provided stable temperature, the stone walls that blocked the wind. He did not charge for the information. He did not ask for payment in trade. He simply showed what he had built and answered questions until the visitors understood. Mercer watched from the ladder one afternoon as Martin explained the air circulation to a young couple from a claim near the county line. "You are giving it away," Mercer said after they left. "Giving what away?" "The knowledge, the work you did. You could ask for something in return." Martin looked at the chamber walls, the walls Mercer had helped him repair. "You taught me the stonework. Did you ask for payment?" "That was different. I saw good work that deserved to be finished. And I see people who deserve to survive next winter. What is the difference?" Mercer said nothing, but the corner of his mouth lifted slightly, and Martin understood that he had passed some kind of test. Elias Thorne came on the 12th day after the storm. He did not announce himself. He simply appeared at the woodshed opening, his old frame silhouetted against the gray January sky, and descended the ladder without asking permission. Martin was below, replacing a cracked brick in the stovepipe sleeve. He looked up and saw Thorne standing in the center of the chamber, turning slowly, studying every detail with the same methodical attention he had brought to his first visit in September. "The mortar is sound," Thorne said. It was not a question. "Mercer's work. He knows stone." "He does." Thorne ran his hand along the wall where Martin had repaired the damaged courses. "This section here. You did this?" "I did it. Mercer taught me." Thorne nodded. He walked to the stove and examined the pipe, the damper, the sleeve where it passed through the ceiling. He opened the vent and looked up the shaft. He checked the shelves, the provisions, the rope coiled near the ladder. Finally, he turned to face Martin. "I told you your wife would freeze first and the boy after her." "I remember." "I was wrong." Thorne said the words slowly, as if each one cost him something. "Not wrong about the danger. The danger was real, but wrong about you, wrong about this. You were trying to protect us, in your way. I was trying to prepare you for failure." That is different from protection." Thorne looked around the chamber again. "How many people sheltered here during the storm?" 6. My family plus Pike, Bream, and Bream's hired man. And the air held? The air held. We watched for symptoms. We adjusted the vent. It was close sometimes. My head ached around the 14th hour, but we managed. 6 people, 19 hours. in a room this size. Thorne's voice carried something that might have been wonder. I've survived 15 winters on these plains. I thought I knew what survival looked like. I did not know this. Neither did I. Not until I had to. Thorne walked to the ladder. He put his hand on the first rung, but did not climb. I told you to go back to Iowa. I told you there was nothing here for you. You told me the truth as you understood it. The truth as I understood it would have killed your family. Thorne climbed 2 rungs, then stopped. I will send people to you, people who want to learn what you have built. Will you teach them? I will teach anyone who wants to learn. Good. Thorne climbed the rest of the way and disappeared into the daylight. Martin stood alone in the chamber, surrounded by stone walls and warm air, and understood that something had shifted. He was no longer the man Elias Thorne had come to warn. He was something else now. He was the man Elias Thorne came to for answers. February brought more visitors than Martin could count. They came from claims he had never heard of, some traveling 2 days through snow that still lay deep across the fields. They came with questions about stove placement and vent diameter, and how deep a chamber needed to be to hold stable temperature. They came with stories of what the blizzard had taken from them, children, parents, livestock, neighbors, and they came with determination to make sure it never took again. Martin showed them all. He drew diagrams in the dirt floor of the chamber. He let them measure the walls, the ceiling height, the distance from stove to vent. He explained what had worked and what had nearly failed, the smoke on the first test, the thinning air at hour 14, the struggle to balance heat against breathability. Mercer helped when he could. The old stonemason had become a regular presence, arriving every few days to check on the chamber and offer advice to visitors who asked about construction techniques. He taught stone selection to a farmer from Pawnee County. He showed a Norwegian carpenter how to sleeve a pipe passage with clay brick. He explained load bearing to a group of settlers planning a community shelter large enough for multiple families. One afternoon in late February, after the last visitor had left, Mercer sat on the overturned bucket that had become his customary seat and watched Martin reorganize the shelves. "You have become a teacher," Mercer said. "I've become someone who answers questions. That is not the same thing." "It is exactly the same thing. A teacher is someone who knows something others need to know and shares it without being forced." Mercer paused. "I taught bridge masons for 6 years. I know what teaching looks like. You're doing it." "You taught me. I'm just passing it forward." "That is what teaching is." Martin finished with the shelves and sat on the pallet where his family had slept through the blizzard. What happens when people start building these shelters and they do not work? What happens when someone makes a mistake I did not warn them about and their family dies? Then you taught them imperfectly, and you teach the next ones better. That is cold comfort for the ones who die. Mercer looked at the stone walls. Do you know how many men died building the railroad? How many bridges collapsed because someone calculated wrong, or stone shifted, or the river rose higher than anyone expected? No. Neither do I. Not exactly, but it was more than I could count. Mercer stood and walked to the wall he had helped repair. Every bridge I built, ere I knew that failure was possible, every piece of knowledge I passed to other masons, I knew they might misunderstand it or apply it wrong. But I built anyway, I taught anyway, because the alternative was to know something useful and keep it to myself while people died for lack of it. And if my teaching kills someone, then you carry that weight, the same way I carry the weight of the men who died under that abutment in 74. Mercer met Martin's eyes. You do not get to do useful work without risk. You only get to choose which risks you are willing to bear. The first disagreement came in March. Spring was approaching, still distant, still theoretical but present in the lengthening days and the occasional afternoon when the temperature climbed above freezing. The worst of winter had passed. The settlement was beginning to breathe again. A delegation arrived from a claim near the Otto County line. 3 men, brothers, who had lost their mother in the blizzard. They wanted to build a shelter large enough for their 3 families, 9 adults and 7 children. They had found a natural depression in a hillside that they believed would work for an excavated chamber. Mercer accompanied Martin to examine the site. The depression was wrong. Martin saw it immediately, but he was not sure how to explain what he saw. Mercer studied the hillside for nearly an hour, walking the contours, testing the soil, examining the drainage patterns that were just becoming visible as the snow melted. "You cannot build here," Mercer finally said. The eldest brother, a man named Schur, frowned. "Why not? The depression is natural. Marsh, we would not need to dig as deep." "The depression is natural because water made it. Water has been running down this hillside for 100 years, pooling here, seeping into the soil." Mercer pointed to the low end of the depression. "See how the earth is darker there? That is not just shadow, that is moisture. Build a chamber here and it will flood every spring. We can dig drainage channels. You can try. The water will find a way around them. Water always finds a way." Mercer shook his head. "Build on the ridge instead. You will have to dig deeper, but the chamber will stay dry. The ridge is solid rock for 4 feet down. We would need to quarry it out." "Then quarry it out." Stuer looked at Martin. "What do you say?" Martin had been watching Mercer, learning even now. "I say Mercer knows water and stone better than I do. If he says this site will flood, it will flood. But the work is the price of doing it right." Martin walked to the depression and knelt at the lowest point. He pressed his hand into the soil. It was soft, saturated, nothing like the packed earth floor of his own chamber. "Build here and you will spend every spring bailing water. Build here and your provisions will rot. Build here, and when the next blizzard comes, you will be standing in 6 inches of ice melt, wondering why you did not listen." Schur stared at the depression. His brothers stood behind him, waiting. "We do not have tools for quarrying rock," Schur said. "I do," Mercer said, "and I will teach you how to use them. But I will not help you build something that will fail." The brothers argued among themselves for several minutes. Finally, Schur turned back. "We will build on the ridge, but we will need your help with the rock. You will have it." The quarrying work took 3 weeks. Mercer led the labor, teaching the brothers and Martin how to read the stone, where to place the wedges, how to split a block along its natural grain instead of fighting against it. The work was brutal, harder than anything Martin had done in the construction of his own chamber, but the result was a foundation carved from living rock, a floor that would never shift, and walls that began with stone nature had already placed. Martin spent every day at the site. Ada managed the claim in his absence, helped by Noah, who had become surprisingly competent at the small tasks of frontier survival. The boy chopped kindling, he fed the cow. He checked the chamber temperature and reported it to his mother every morning, maintaining the habit Martin had established during the winter. On the last day of the quarrying, Mercer set down his hammer and sat on a block of limestone they had not yet moved. His breathing was heavy. His face was pale. "Are you well?" Martin asked. "Tired. I'm always tired these days." Mercer looked at the excavation, the clean-cut walls, the beginning of what would become a shelter for 16 people. "But this is good work. Solid. It will last." "Because you taught us how to do it right." "Because the stone allowed it." Mercer closed his eyes for a moment. "I have built bridges that fell.
I have built walls that cracked, but I have never built a foundation that shifted because I learned early to respect what the rock wanted. What does this rock want? Mercer opened his eyes and smiled slightly. It wants to hold people safe, same as your chamber, same as every shelter that was ever worth building. April arrived with mud. The snow melted. The roads became rivers of black muck that swallowed wagon wheels to the axle. The creek that had provided Martin's clay rose 6 feet and flooded the low ground near its banks. The world transformed from white death to brown chaos, and somehow, improbably, it felt like hope. Martin finished the shelter on the ridge with the brothers. The chamber was larger than his own, 12 by 14 feet, with a ceiling high enough for a tall man to stand straight. It had 2 stoves instead of 1, positioned to heat the space evenly, with separate flues and a vent system Martin had refined based on his winter experience. "We will test it next fall," Shure said as they stood in the completed chamber. "Before the cold comes, we will bring our families here and stay a night. Make sure everything works." "That is wise. I wish I had done the same." "You did not have time. You built against a deadline that would not wait." "And I was lucky. Everything could have failed. The flue could have reversed. The mortar could have cracked. The air could have turned before I understood what was happening." Martin ran his hand along the stone wall. "You have something I did not have. You have time to get it right. We have it because you taught us what to look for." Jure extended his hand. "Thank you for everything." Martin shook it. "Survive next winter. That is all the thanks I need." Mercer did not come to see the finished shelter. Martin rode to his soddy on a Thursday afternoon and found him in bed. The old stonemason was gaunt, hollow-cheeked, his skin the color of old parchment. He had been sick for a week, he said. A cough that would not clear, a weakness in his limbs that made standing difficult. "You should have sent word," Martin said. "And what would you have done? Carried me to your cellar and nursed me like an infant?" Mercer coughed, a wet sound that rattled in his chest. "I have been sick before. I will be sick again. This is not your concern." "You helped me save my family. That makes your health my concern." Mercer was silent for a long moment. Then he said, "Sit down. I have something to tell you." Martin sat on the only chair in the soddy. Mercer propped himself up against the earthen wall. "I came west because I had nothing left in the east. My wife died. My employer went bankrupt. The men I had trained took positions I could not find for myself. I was 51 years old, and I had nothing but knowledge no one wanted to pay for. You have used that knowledge here. The shelter, the teaching. I have used it because I met someone who saw value in it. You saw an old man selling kindling and asked him to teach you stonework. Most people would have bought the kindling and sent me on my way." Mercer coughed again. "You understood that knowledge has value even when the person carrying it looks like nothing. I needed help. You had what I needed. And you paid for it fairly, with respect, with willingness to learn, with the promise of future labor that I know you will keep." Mercer's voice was weakening. "That is rarer than you think. Most men want knowledge without cost." "Wait, they want the benefit without the relationship. You understood that teaching is a partnership. You sound like you are saying goodbye." "I am saying what needs to be said while I can still say it." Mercer closed his eyes. "I will not see another winter. I know the signs. This cough is not the kind that clears. You cannot know that. I know what I know." Mercer opened his eyes again. "You will finish what we started. The shelters, the teaching, the spreading of what you have learned. You do not need me for that anymore. I need your knowledge. You have my knowledge. I gave it to you over the winter, piece by piece. The rest you will learn by doing, the same way I learned. Mercer reached out and gripped Martin's wrist with surprising strength. Promise me something. Anything. Do not stop teaching when I am gone. Do not let the knowledge become yours alone. Find others who can carry it. Train them the way I trained you. Make sure that when you die, years from now, decades from now, there are men who know what you know. I promise. Mercer released his wrist. He lay back against the wall and closed his eyes. Good. Now go home. Your family needs you more than I do. Mercer died on the 17th of April. Martin found him the next morning, still propped against the wall, his face peaceful, his hands folded across his chest. The cough had taken him in the night, or his heart had failed, or simply the accumulation of years had finally grown too heavy to bear. Martin buried him behind the soddy, in ground that was still soft from the spring thaw. He carved a marker from a piece of limestone, a skill Mercer had never explicitly taught him, but which he understood now from all the other lessons. The stone read, Asa Mercer, stonemason, who built to last. He stood at the grave for a long time, not praying exactly, but remembering. The first lesson about reading a wall, the patient instruction on mortar mixing, the stories about the railroad, the bridges, the men who had died because stone did what weight demanded, the quiet respect Mercer had shown for good work, regardless of who did it. The earth forgives what air punishes. Mercer had never said those words, but he had lived them. He had understood that the ground held secrets the sky could never touch. Martin walked back to his claim through fields that were turning green with the first spring grass. Ada met him at the door. She saw his face and said nothing. I'd just held him while he stood there with mud on his boots and grief in his chest. That night, for the first time since the blizzard, the family slept in the house instead of the chamber. The weather was warm, the walls held. The season of survival had ended. But Martin knew as he lay in the darkness listening to his wife breathe that the season of teaching had just begun. The first crisis without Mercer came in May. A family named Grindheim, Norwegian settlers from a claim 20 miles northwest, sent word that their shelter was failing. They had built it over the winter based on descriptions from neighbors who had visited Martin's chamber. They had not consulted Martin directly, had not asked Mercer for guidance on the stonework. They had built what they thought they understood. Now the spring rains had come. Neon water was seeping through the walls. Martin rode out the next morning. He found a chamber that was half filled with brown water, the provisions on the lower shelves rotted or ruined, the family standing in the yard with expressions of bewildered despair. We built it deep, the father said. His name was Herbrand. We thought deep was better, closer to the stable temperature you described. Martin climbed down the ladder. The water was knee-deep and examined the walls. The stone was poorly fitted, with gaps between the blocks that the builders had stuffed with clay. The clay had washed out. Water poured through the openings in steady streams. He understood the problem immediately. They had built in a low spot. They had not lined the exterior with waterproofing. They had trusted that depth alone would protect them. So every one of those mistakes was something Mercer would have caught, something Mercer would have warned against. Martin climbed out of the flooded chamber and faced Herbrand. The site is wrong. The construction is wrong. The waterproofing is wrong. He saw the man's face fall. But the stone is good. The basic structure is sound. We can fix this. How? Drainage trenches around the exterior, clay lining on the outside of the walls, a sump pit inside to collect what seeps through anyway, with a path to carry it away from the chamber. Martin looked at the site, visualizing what needed to be done.
It will take a week, maybe 2. We cannot afford to pay. You cannot afford not to do it. If this chamber floods next winter while your family is inside, you will freeze before you can dig out. Martin started toward his horse. I will bring tools tomorrow. We start at dawn. The work was harder without Mercer. Not the physical labor. Martin had done hard work his whole life, but the decisions. The judgment calls about where to dig, how deep to trench, how much clay was enough. Every time he reached for certainty, he found only the echo of Mercer's voice, explaining principles that Martin had thought he understood, but now realized he had only begun to grasp. He made mistakes. The first drainage trench was too shallow. He had to deepen it. The clay lining cracked in one section where he had not mixed it properly. He had to strip it out and start over. A stone shifted during the repair work, and for a terrifying moment Martin was back in Mercer's story, imagining the weight coming down on him the way it had come down on those men in '74. But he kept working. He kept learning. He kept asking himself what Mercer would have done, and when he could not answer, he experimented until he found something that worked. By the end of the second week, the Grindheim shelter was watertight. The drainage trenches carried spring runoff away from the walls. The clay lining held. The sump pit, which Martin had improvised from a technique Mercer had described for bridge foundations, collected whatever moisture still seeped through and channeled it to a stone-lined drain. It will hold, Martin said when the work was finished. But you need to check the trenches every spring, clear them if they silt up, replace the clay if it cracks. Herbrand nodded. How do we thank you? Learn from this. And when someone else builds wrong, each help them fix it the way I helped you. If this story reminds you why preparation matters, share it with someone who needs to hear it. Summer brought a different kind of crisis. A fever swept through the settlement in late June. It started with the children, headache, vomiting, a heat that burned through the small bodies like fire through dry grass. By the time the first adults fell ill, 3 children had already died. Martin's family was spared. Ada believed it was because they had spent the winter below ground, breathing clean air while the surface world filled with whatever sickness the blizzard had carried. Martin did not know if that was true, but he did not argue. What he knew was that the sick needed shelter. The frame houses, hot in summer, offered no relief from the fever, whilst the children burned in beds that grew soaked with sweat. The parents, exhausted from nursing, fell ill themselves and had nowhere to go. Martin opened the chamber. It was not designed for summer use. The temperature below was 50 degrees, comfortable in winter, but cold for a feverish child. But 50 degrees was cooler than 90, and cool was what the sick needed. He carried the first child down himself, a girl named Sigrid, 5 years old, daughter of a family that had settled near the county line. Her mother followed, too weak to carry the girl but too frightened to let her out of sight. It is cold, the mother said. Cold breaks fever. Wrap her in blankets but keep her head cool. Give her water when she wakes. Over the next week, the chamber became a hospital. Martin brought in a second pallet, then a third. Ada managed the water supply, hauling bucket after bucket from the well and passing them down the ladder. Noah ran messages between the chamber and the families of the sick, reporting on conditions, fetching medicines when they could be found. 9 children passed through the chamber that summer. 7 survived. The 2 who died had been too far gone before they arrived. The fever had damaged something inside them that cold could not repair. Martin carried their bodies up the ladder himself, wrapped them in blankets, and helped dig the graves in ground that was still soft from spring. But the 7 who lived, they were evidence. Evidence that the shelter was not just a winter refuge. Evidence that the stable temperature Mercer had taught him to value had uses no one had imagined when the first stone was laid.
Silas Bream came to the claim in late July. He came alone, without his wagon, walking the road in the summer heat with his hat in his hand. Martin was repairing the barn wall, the section that had never been finished, when he saw the figure approaching. He set down his tools and waited. Bream stopped 10 feet away. He looked at the barn, the house, the woodshed that hid the chamber entrance. He looked everywhere except at Martin's face. "I heard about the fever," Bream said. "I heard you sheltered the sick down there." "I did. I heard 2 died." "2 died. 7 lived." Bream nodded slowly. He turned his hat in his hands, working the brim between his fingers. "My nephew took sick. My brother's boy, 8 years old. The fever came on 3 days ago." Bream finally met Martin's eyes. "They do not know what to do. Sir, they have tried everything. Cold compresses, willow, bark tea, prayer. And he is still burning. He is still screaming when the headaches come. He is still," Bream's voice broke, "he is still dying, and my brother will not bring him here because I told him your cellar was a coffin. I told him you were a fool. I told everyone who would listen that what you built was dangerous and wrong." Martin said nothing. "I was wrong." Bream said the words like they were being torn from him. "I was wrong about the cellar. I was wrong about you. I was wrong about everything, and now my nephew is dying because my brother believes what I told him. Then go tell him something different." "He will not listen to me. He thinks I am trying to cover my own shame." Bream stepped closer. "But he might listen to you. He knows what happened during the blizzard. He knows I sheltered here. If you came with me, if you told him what you told the other families, you want me to save your nephew so you can stop feeling guilty. I want you to save my nephew because he's 8 years old and he has done nothing wrong. My guilt is my own to carry. His life is not a price he should pay for my stupidity." Martin looked at the man who had mocked him, threatened him, predicted his family's death, and then crawled into his shelter when the blizzard came. The man who had told everyone the cellar was a grave and then watched it become a refuge. "Where is your brother's claim?" The boy's name was Tolef. He was 8 years old, blond, with a face that had probably been cheerful before the fever hollowed it. When Martin arrived, the boy was unconscious, his breathing shallow, his skin hot to the touch. The brother's name was Knut. He stood in the doorway of the frame house, blocking the entrance, his face hard with grief and suspicion. "Silas sent you," Knut said. "Silas asked me to come. I came because there is a sick child. And you want to put him in your hole in the ground. I want to put him somewhere cooler than this house, somewhere the fever might break instead of climbing higher." Martin looked past Knut to the bed where Tolef lay. "How long has he been unconscious?" "Since this morning." "Has he taken water?" "He cannot swallow. It comes back up." Martin had seen this before. With the children who had died, the fever climbed until the body could not fight it anymore, and then the body stopped fighting everything, stopped swallowing, stopped breathing, stopped living.
"Let me try," Martin said. "Silas said your cellar was a death trap. He said, I know what Silas said. Silas was wrong. Silas has admitted he was wrong. He is standing right there." Martin pointed to where Bream waited near the road, unwilling to come closer. "Ask him yourself if you do not believe me." Knut looked at his brother. Bream nodded once, a small motion that carried more weight than any words. "If my son dies in your hole? If your son dies, it will be because the fever was too strong, not because of where he spent his last hours." Martin stepped forward. "But if he lives, and I have seen children live who were worse than this, it will be because we did something instead of nothing. Let me try." Knut stood aside.
The ride back to the claim took an hour. Martin held Tolef in front of him on the horse, the boy's body limp against his chest. Ada had the chamber ready when they arrived. The pallet laid with clean blankets, the lanterns lit, a bucket of cool water waiting by the ladder. They laid Tolef on the pallet and stripped off his shirt. His skin was burning. His eyes, when Martin lifted the lids, showed only white. "The water," Ada said. "We need to cool him." They soaked cloths in the well water and laid them across Tolef's forehead, his chest, his arms. They changed the cloths every few minutes as the fever sucked the coolness out of them. Martin monitored the chamber temperature, 52 degrees, and the boy's breathing, counting the breaths, watching for any change. 2 hours passed, then 3. The sun set above them, unseen in the underground room. The lanterns flickered. Noah brought fresh water and carried away the warm buckets without being asked. Near midnight, Tolef's breathing changed. It deepened, slowed. The rasping quality that had worried Martin began to ease. The boy's skin, which had been hot enough to hurt the hand that touched it, began to cool. "He is breaking," Ada said. "Not yet, but he is close." By dawn, the fever had broken. Tolef opened his eyes for the first time in 2 days. He looked at the stone walls, the lantern light, the face of a man he had never met, and asked for water. Martin gave him water. Then he climbed the ladder and found Knut Bream waiting in the morning light, his face hollow from a sleepless night. "He is alive. The fever broke an hour ago." Knut did not speak. He did not move. He stood there in the dawn light, and then his knees buckled, and he sank to the ground and wept. Silas Bream stood nearby, watching. When Martin looked at him, Bream said nothing, but he nodded once, the same small motion he had given his brother the day before. It was not gratitude. It was not apology. It was acknowledgement that everything had changed. August brought the harvest. The wheat came in thin, but sufficient. The corn had struggled through the wet spring, but recovered in the summer heat. The settlement, which had spent the winter dying and the spring rebuilding, now turned to the ancient work of bringing in food for the year to come. Martin worked his own fields, but he also traveled. He visited the shelters that had been built over the spring and summer, 11 in total, scattered across 4 counties. He checked the stonework, the drainage, the ventilation. Or he made notes on what had worked and what needed improvement. He taught the families who owned them how to maintain what they had built. The hostile skeptic was gone. Silas Bream no longer sold wood with warnings about foolish alternatives. He sold wood with stories about the blizzard, about the fever, about his nephew who had survived because of a hole in the ground he had once called a coffin. The practical skeptic had become an ally. Jonah Pike helped build 2 shelters that summer, applying what he had learned during his night in Martin's chamber. He still had reservations. He still thought people belonged above ground in the daylight, but he no longer doubted that the shelters worked. The authority skeptic had become something like a partner. Elias Thorne sent families to Martin for guidance. Then he referred to the chamber as the Vale Shelter when he spoke to newcomers. He told the story of the blizzard to anyone who would listen, always ending with the same line. "I told him his wife would freeze. His wife slept through the storm in 54 degrees while I burned a cord of wood to stay alive." And the mentor was gone. But his lessons remained, in the way Martin read stone, in the way he judged drainage, in the way he taught others to build what would last. The chamber under the woodshed still stood. Martin had reinforced the hatch, added a second ladder as backup, and expanded the shelving to hold more provisions. It was no longer just a shelter. It was a classroom, a demonstration, a proof that could be touched and measured and walked through. The earth forgives what air punishes. Mercer had never said it. But Martin said it now,
to everyone who came to learn. The second winter came easier than the first. Martin had spent the fall preparing not just his own claim, but helping others prepare theirs. He traveled to 11 shelters across 4 counties, checking construction, testing ventilation, advising on provisions. He left each one with a list of what to watch for: cracks in mortar, settling in foundations, ice buildup in vent pipes, and a promise to return if anything went wrong. The cold arrived in early November, gentle at first, then deepening through the month. December brought snow that stayed, blanketing the plains in white silence. January brought the deep freeze, temperatures dropping below zero and staying there for days at a time. But this January was different. When the cold came, families descended into shelters they had built with their own hands, following plans Martin had helped them draw. They lit stoves they had tested in autumn, vented through pipes they had sealed correctly, warmed rooms they understood. They emerged when the weather broke, returned to their houses, and waited for the next storm. No one froze. The count came in slowly through February as the settlement compared notes. 12 families had used shelters during the worst cold. All 12 had survived. The fuel savings were significant. Families reported burning half or less of what they had consumed the previous winter because small rooms needed small fires. Thorne calculated the numbers one afternoon, sitting in Martin's kitchen with a cup of coffee that had gone cold while he talked. Last winter, in this district lost 4 people to the cold. This winter, we lost none. Thorne set down his cup. That is not luck. That is preparation. It is people building what they needed instead of hoping the old ways would hold. It is you teaching them to build it. Thorne leaned back in his chair. I have lived on these plains for 17 years. I have watched men fight the winter every way they could think of. Bigger houses, more wood, better stoves, thicker walls. None of it worked the way your shelters work. The shelters work because of what Mercer taught me. The earth holds stable temperature. The stone blocks wind. The small space needs less fuel. None of that was my invention. But bringing it together was understanding how the pieces fit. Thorne stood and walked to the window, looking out at the snow-covered fields. I told you once that you should go back to Iowa, that there was nothing here for you. I remember. I was wrong about that, too. There was nothing here for me because I'd stopped seeing possibilities. You saw something I had walked past 100 times without noticing. I fell through a floor. That is not vision. That is clumsiness. Thorne laughed, a rare sound, rusty from disuse. Sometimes clumsiness and vision are the same thing. You fell through a floor and you saw a room. Most men would have seen a hole. Spring brought new students. They came from farther away now, from counties Martin had never visited, from settlements he had only heard mentioned in passing. Well, they came because the story had spread through the networks that connected frontier communities. The man in Gage County who had survived the children's blizzard in a stone room under his woodshed, who had taught others to build the same, who asked nothing in return but that they pass the knowledge forward. Martin taught them all. He walked them through his chamber, explaining every element. He took them to other shelters in the district, showing the variations that worked and the ones that had needed repair. He drew diagrams in the dirt and on scraps of paper. He answered questions until the questioners ran out of questions. Ada had become part of the teaching. She showed the women how to organize provisions for extended stays below, which foods kept best in the cool darkness, how to rotate supplies so nothing spoiled, now where to store water so it would not freeze even in the coldest nights. She explained the small details that made survival bearable: the hooks for hanging clothing so it would not touch the damp walls, the platform for wet boots, the arrangement of pallets so a family could sleep together without crowding the stove. "You have become a school," she said one evening after the latest group of visitors had departed.
I have become someone who answers questions. That is what a school is. Ada set down the mending she had been working on. When we came here, I thought we would farm. I thought we would raise wheat and corn, and maybe some cattle if we ever had the money. I did not think we would teach. We still farm. We farm around the teaching. The teaching has become the center. Martin considered this. It was true. The rhythms of the claim had shifted over the past year. He still worked the fields, still tended the livestock, still repaired the endless small breakages that frontier life demanded. But increasingly his time went to visitors, to letters asking for advice, to trips to help families whose shelters needed adjustment. Is that a problem? It is a change. Ada picked up her mending again. I'm not complaining. I'm noticing. The life we are building is not the life I expected. Is it worse? It is different, better in some ways, harder in others. She looked at him over the fabric. You have become important. People depend on you now. That is a weight. Mercer carried the same weight. He taught me how to carry it. Mercer died alone in a soddy, wearing patched clothes and selling kindling to survive. Is that the life you want? The question hung in the air. Martin did not have an easy answer. I want to do what I can do. The teaching is something I can do, whether it leads to wealth or poverty. He shook his head. I cannot control that. I can only control whether I pass forward what was given to me. Ada was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, I married a farmer who became a teacher. I did not plan for that, but I do not regret it. Even when the visitors wake you at dawn? Even then, she smiled slightly, though I would not mind if they waited until after breakfast. The hostile skeptic's final transformation came in April. Silas Bream appeared at the claim on a morning when rain was threatening, his wagon loaded not with wood, but with stone. Good limestone, quarried and cut, stacked neatly in the bed. Martin walked out to meet him, unsure what to expect. I have been thinking, Bream said without preamble, about what you built, about what I said, about my nephew and the blizzard and all the rest of it. And I am tired of selling wood to people who cannot afford enough of it. I am tired of watching families burn through their savings buying fuel that a smaller room would not need. Bream climbed down from the wagon and stood facing Martin. I want to learn to build what you build. I want to become something other than the man who profits from other people's desperation. Martin looked at the stone. It was good quality, better than what he had found on his own property. Why? Because my brother's boy almost died. Because I sheltered in your cellar while calling it a coffin. Because I have spent 2 years watching you save lives while I counted money. Bream's voice was rough. I am not a good man. I have never claimed to be, but I can be useful. I know stone, where to find it, how to haul it, who has it on their property and does not know its value. That knowledge has to be worth something. It is worth a great deal. Stone is the hardest part for most families. They have timber, they have labor. They do not have quarried limestone. Then let me supply it. Let me haul it to families who need it. Let me become part of this instead of fighting against it. Martin studied the man who had mocked him, threatened him, and then crawled into his shelter to survive. The man who had watched his nephew nearly die and had finally understood that pride was a luxury the frontier could not afford. The stone in your wagon, where did it come from? My woodlot. There's a limestone outcrop on the north end that I have been walking past for years. I hired a man to quarry it last month. And the price? Cost of labor plus hauling. I take no profit. Bream met Martin's eyes. I have enough money. I do not have enough peace. Maybe this will help. Martin extended his hand. Bream shook it. Welcome to the work. The summer of 1889 brought a test Martin had not anticipated. A drought settled over the plains in June and did not lift. The wheat withered, the corn stunted. The creek that had provided Martin's clay dropped to a trickle and then disappeared entirely. Wells that had never failed began to show mud instead of water. The shelters that had saved lives in winter now faced a different challenge. The stable underground temperature that had preserved food through the cold also preserved it through the heat, but only if there was food to preserve. Families who had planned for blizzards had not planned for crop failure. The provisions on their shelves, meant to last through winter storms, began to seem insufficient for a year when the harvest would not come. Martin called a meeting in late July. 14 families gathered at his claim, everyone within reasonable riding distance who had built a shelter or was planning to build one. They stood in the yard in the summer heat, sweat soaking their clothes, worry creasing their faces. "We have a problem," Martin said. "And the problem is not the drought. The drought will end. The rains will come, eventually. The problem is how we survive until they do." "We have our shelters," Sure Greentime said. "We have provisions stored." "You have provisions for winter storms. A few days, maybe a week. You do not have provisions for a failed harvest." "Neither do I. Neither does anyone here." "Then what do we do?" Martin had been thinking about this for weeks. The answer was not a shelter. The answer was not a technique. The answer was something older and simpler. We share. We pool what we have. We make sure no family starves while another has surplus. "That is charity," someone said from the back. "Charity breeds weakness." "Charity is one person giving to another who cannot repay. What I am proposing is different." Martin looked at the gathered faces. Every family here has something another family needs. The Tevite claim has a well that still runs. The Grindheim claim has stored grain from last year's harvest. Bream has stone and the means to haul it. Pike has timber. I have knowledge and a shelter that can store more provisions than my family needs. You are proposing trade. I am proposing a network, a way of connecting what we have to what we need. When winter comes, we do not each face it alone. We face it together with the combined resources of everyone in this circle. The discussion lasted 3 hours. There were objections, arguments, moments when Martin thought the whole idea would collapse under the weight of individual pride and frontier independence. But by the end, they had agreed. A shared storehouse would be built at the center of the district, a shelter larger than any individual family could use. Designed to hold provisions for the community. Each family would contribute what they could spare. Each family would draw what they needed. The accounting would be tracked on paper, balanced across the year, settled in labor or goods or whatever each family could offer. It was not socialism. It was not charity. It was survival by cooperation, the same principle that had saved 6 people in Martin's chamber during the blizzard, expanded to a scale that could save a settlement through a drought. The community shelter was finished in September. Bream hauled the stone. Pike provided timber. The Grindheim brothers did the excavation. Martin supervised the construction, applying everything Mercer had taught him and everything he had learned since. The chamber was 20 feet by 30, the largest Martin had ever designed. With 3 separate stoves, a sophisticated ventilation system, and shelving enough to hold food for 50 people. They stocked it with what the drought had left them. The harvest was poor, less than half of a normal year, but combined across 14 families, it was enough. Grain, beans, dried meat, preserved vegetables, enough to survive if they were careful, enough to reach spring when the rains would surely return. The drought broke in October. The rains came hard and fast, flooding the creeks, soaking the parched ground, promising a better year to come. But the community shelter remained. It had become something more than a drought response. It had become a center, a gathering place, a physical expression of the network Martin had proposed. Families used it through the winter, not because their individual shelters failed, but because gathering together was easier than sheltering apart. They shared meals, they shared stories, they shared the long, dark nights when the wind howled and the temperature dropped and the world outside tried to kill them. And in the spring, when the snow melted and the fields turned green, they emerged together. The years that followed compressed into patterns. Seasons turned. Crops grew or failed. Children were born, grew, left to start their own claims. The settlement expanded, contracted, stabilized. The shelters multiplied, 20 by 1890, 35 by 1895, more than 50 by the turn of the century. Martin taught until he had taught everyone who wanted to learn. Then he taught the ones who would teach others. A second generation of builders emerged, the men and women who had learned from Martin the way Martin had learned from Mercer. They carried the knowledge outward to counties Martin had never visited, to territories he had only heard mentioned. Ada's role grew alongside his. She became the keeper of records, who had built where the shelters were located, which families had surplus and which had need. She organized the community storehouse, managed the sharing network, kept the accounts that made cooperation possible. The two of them became a partnership in ways they had not been during those first desperate months. "We are no longer just surviving," she said one evening, years after the blizzard. They were sitting in the chamber, their chamber, the original, the one that had started everything. Noah was grown now, married. It's building his own claim with his own shelter 20 miles north. "We have not been just surviving for a long time." "I know, but sometimes I forget. Sometimes I look at what we have built, and I cannot quite believe it started with a hole in the ground and a pile of rotting boards." Martin looked at the stone walls. They were the same walls Mercer had helped him repair, the same walls that had held 6 people through 19 hours of blizzard, the same walls that had cooled fever-burning children and stored provisions through drought and sheltered travelers who had nowhere else to go. It started with falling through a floor. Everything that came after was trying to make sense of what I found. Mercer said you saw a room where other men would see a hole. Thorne said that. Mercer said something different. Martin closed his eyes. "We're remembering." He said the stone wanted to hold people safe. That good work is about understanding what the material wants. "And what did you want?" "To keep my family alive. That was all I wanted in the beginning." Martin opened his eyes. Everything else, the teaching, the network, the community shelter that came later, that came from understanding that keeping my family alive meant keeping everyone alive, because alone, we were all going to freeze. Martin Vail died in the autumn of 1912 at the age of 59. He had lived long enough to see the railroad reach the settlement, bringing lumber and coal that made the shelters less critical for survival, but no less valued. He had lived long enough to see his son build a larger shelter than his own, with improvements Martin had suggested and refinements Noah had invented. He had lived long enough to see the community storehouse become a permanent institution, managed by a committee that included Shure Grindheim's eldest daughter and Silas Bream's nephew, the boy whose fever had broken in Martin's chamber, now a man grown. He spent his last weeks in the chamber, not because the house had failed, but because the underground room had become his place. The stone walls held memories the way they held heat. Every crack in the mortar, every worn spot on the stairs, every smoke stain on the ceiling told a story he could read with his eyes closed. Ada sat with him through the long nights. Noah came when he could, bringing his children to say goodbye to the grandfather they barely knew. The settlement came in ones and twos. Thorn, bent with age but still walking. Pike, gray-haired now, carrying a gift of kindling he insisted Martin would need. Bream, silent for once, sitting in the corner and watching the man he had once called a fool. On the last night, Martin asked Ada to help him up the ladder. She protested, but he insisted. He stood in the woodshed, leaning on her shoulder, looking at the stars through the gaps in the roof. "I fell through this floor," he said. "I thought I had broken something. My leg, maybe, the wagon axle. The dream of making this place into a home. You fell through the floor and found a room. I fell through the floor and found a life." Martin looked at her. "Everything that mattered came from that moment. Everything we built, everyone we helped. It all started with a bad step on a rotten board. It started with you. The board was just the opportunity." Martin smiled. He let her help him back down the ladder. He lay on the pallet where his family had slept through the blizzard, where fever-burning children had cooled, where he had taught and planned and dreamed for 25 years. "The earth forgives what air punishes," he said. "Mercer never said that. I always said it was his wisdom, but it was not. It was something I understood after he was gone, something about how the world works when you stop fighting it." "It sounds like something he would have said. It sounds like something he taught me without saying, the way he taught everything, by showing, by doing, by trusting that I would figure it out." Ada held his hand. The lantern burned low. The stone walls held their steady temperature, 54 degrees, the same as they had held for a quarter century. Martin closed his eyes. 14 families learned from Martin Vale in the years after the blizzard. Each of those families taught others. By 1900, more than 50 shelters stood across southeastern Nebraska, and the design had spread to Kansas, Iowa, and the Dakota Territories. The community storehouse that Martin proposed during the drought became a model for cooperative survival that other settlements adapted to their own needs. Martin lived out his years on the same quarter section he had bought for $19 in 1887. The frame house he had struggled to heat eventually gained a proper stone foundation, but the chamber under the woodshed remained unchanged. He died in that chamber on a cool October night, surrounded by family, in the room that had started as a hole in the ground and became the center of everything he built. On January 12th, 1888, the temperature had dropped 60 degrees in 8 hours. Elias Thorne had stood in Martin's doorway and delivered his verdict. "If you spend November digging holes instead of stacking wood, your wife will freeze first and the boy after her." That night, the blizzard screamed across the plains and killed 300 people who had trusted their walls and their stoves and their calculations. But in a stone room 7 feet below a woodshed floor, 6 people slept through the howling wind in 54-degree air. Ada breathed without coughing. Noah dreamed of summer. And Martin Vale, the man who had dug a hole when everyone said to stack wood, watched the lantern flame hold steady against limestone walls that the wind could not touch. He had not saved everyone. He had not stopped the cold from killing, but he had found a warm place in the frozen earth and shown others how to find their own. The boots lined along that cellar wall, 6 pairs, belonging to men who had laughed and warned and threatened and finally climbed down seeking shelter. Those boots were the answer to every doubt. Not a speech, not a philosophy, just leather and mud and the evidence of survival left standing in a room the world had called a grave,